Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua. Chiede il maestro delle cerimonie di leggere il messaggio.
So the news this week has been, well, significant. Pope Francis passing away at 88. It's definitely a moment that makes you stop and think.
Absolutely. It's major news.
And for our listeners, people who really want to understand the context behind the headlines, this deep dive is about going a bit further, right?
Exactly. Beyond just the announcement itself.
We want to explore, the core aspects of his life and his time as Pope.
Right. Because when something this big happens, you get flooded with information. It can be overwhelming.
Totally.
So our focus here, using that Fox News report you mentioned, is to try and give a clearer picture of Pope Francis's impact.
Yes, sift through it all.
Find what really defined his papacy.
Right. So think of this less like a full biography, more like a focused look at the essentials. We're using that article as a guide, basically. The mission is to pull out the key insights, who he was, the big things he did, the legacy he leaves, just structured so it makes sense and hopefully saves you some time figuring it all out.
Makes sense.
So where do we start? The announcement itself.
Yeah, I think the immediate reaction begins there. The official word came from the Vatican Camerlengo, Cardinal Kevin Farrell.
Okay.
Announced his death this morning, 7:35 a.m. That formal step, it kicks off a whole series of protocols in the church.
And it's pretty striking the timing mentioned in the article about Vice President J.D. Vance. He just met the Pope on Sunday.
Yeah, that really stands out.
Must make it feel very immediate, very personal for him.
It certainly adds that layer, doesn't it? Vance shared his reaction, apparently mentioning a homily Pope Francis gave during the early days of COVID.
Oh, interesting.
It kind of underscores how the Pope could connect with people across different backgrounds, different viewpoints.
And beyond those kinds of personal reactions, we're seeing the public response too.
Of course.
The report mentions mourners gathering, not just in Rome, which you'd expect, but also right here in New York at St. Patrick's. Really shows that global reach, the significance he held for so many people worldwide.
It absolutely does. Now, if we start digging into the actual substance of his papacy, a key theme seems to be this effort to bring in more, maybe contemporary influences.
Okay.
While at the same time trying really hard to keep the church unified, with all its different factions, including conservatives.
That sounds like a balancing act.
Oh, definitely. A constant tightrope walk, you could say.
Okay, so these contemporary approaches, let's unpack that a bit. How did that actually play out?
Well, a big part of it was his constant emphasis on mercy, kindness, humility. These weren't just abstract ideas for him.
Right.
They seemed to be practical guides for how he acted, what he said, his whole message, really.
And he wasn't afraid of controversy either, or getting involved in political discussions.
Not at all.
Sure.
He showed a real willingness to engage with tough issues, express his views on political stuff, and predictably, that drew both a lot of support and, well, a lot of criticism too.
The article gives some pretty specific examples, especially with U.S. presidents. Maybe start with President Trump.
Sure. Early in Trump's term, Pope Francis spoke out about the plans for mass deportations.
I remember that.
He really stressed the inherent dignity of every person, arguing that removals like that would ultimately backfire. It was a clear moral stance on a major policy debate.
And it wasn't just Trump. It seems he also offered a kind of counterpoint to Vice President Vance's comments about national identity after his conversion.
Yeah, that's interesting. The article mentions Pope Francis writing to U.S. Catholic bishops, and it seemed like he was addressing that kind of viewpoint.
How so?
He basically laid out this idea that Christian love goes beyond just family or community or nation. It's broader, more universal compassion, not limited by borders.
Challenging that idea of prioritizing national identity first.
Exactly. It makes you think about the scope of Christian charity.
Then there was that big address to Congress in 2015. That was unprecedented, wasn't it?
It really was. First time a pope addressed a joint meeting. And the range of topics, quite something.
What did he cover?
Immigration, family, the death penalty. He explicitly called for abolishing it, climate change, extremism, religious freedom, the refugee crisis. He really pushed Congress on global warming, too.
Wow, quite a list.
Definitely a landmark moment.
Okay, fast forward a bit to 2022. His interactions with President Biden seemed different, especially around abortion.
Yes, that was quite direct. Pope Francis publicly questioned Biden's stance, saying it was sort of incoherent with his Catholic faith.
He brought up the biology.
He did. He mentioned fetal development. A month after conception, the DNA is already there. There is human life. It was a restatement of the church's core teaching.
And it seems he even commented during election campaigns, criticizing both Trump and Harris.
Yeah, there were reports, Associated Press, I think, suggesting he viewed both as against life in different ways. Trump on migrants, Harris on abortion rights.
So applying his moral framework across the board?
Seems like it, yeah. Regardless of party.
The article also mentions appointing Cardinal Robert McElroy in Washington, D.C. How does that fit in?
Well, McElroy had been a vocal critic of Trump's immigration policies before that. So putting him in charge of such a prominent archdiocese, you could see it as Francis strategically placing leaders aligned with certain perspectives within the U.S. church.
Right. Stepping back from the U.S. politics for a second, it's worth remembering his unique place in church history itself.
Absolutely crucial context. First pope from the Americas, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Argentina, to Italian immigrant parents.
And the first Jesuit pope, too.
Correct. And elected in 2013 after Pope Benedict XVI did something quite rare. He resigned.
His own background is pretty fascinating, too, right? Didn't follow the usual path.
Not at all. Early on, he worked some very ordinary jobs. Yeah. Stocking factory, bar bouncer, janitor.
Oh, bouncer.
Yeah.
Oh.
And he studied chemistry, worked in a lab before heading to the seminary. That kind of life experience probably gave him a different lens on things.
And then Argentina's dirty war, that must have been incredibly formative.
Deeply so. He was the head of the Jesuits there during that awful period of repression. He faced threats, worked to protect people, including priests.
The article mentions 2 priests were kidnapped.
Tragically, yes. 2 Jesuits under his leadership. He spoke later about having to negotiate with the military regime to try and secure their release. A really harrowing time.
So after that, he had various roles before becoming a bishop.
Yeah, professor, seminary instructor, rector, parish priest, then Bishop of Alca and Auxiliary in Buenos Aires in '92, which started his rise. Archbishop of Buenos Aires, then Cardinal in 2001.
And the name Francis, that was a very deliberate choice when he became Pope.
Oh, absolutely. Huge symbolism. Choosing Francis, St. Francis of Assisi, it immediately signaled a focus on simplicity, poverty, the poor, those on the margins.
Set the tone right away.
Definitely. It really laid out a direction for his papacy from day one.
And his Jesuit roots must have played a big role in his teaching style, his approach.
Without a doubt. The Jesuit tradition really emphasizes that personal connection with God and making the church feel, well, approachable, accessible to everyone.
Meeting people where they are.
That idea became a real hallmark of his ministry, yes.
But as you said, it wasn't all smooth sailing. His time as Pope involved navigating some really complex, sometimes controversial stuff. Different currents within the church became visible.
That's a really important point. The article brings up his criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza, calling the situation very serious and shameful.
But also condemning anti-Semitism.
Yes, in the same breath, unequivocally condemning anti-Semitism. He also consistently called for peace in Ukraine and was very vocal about climate change, aligning with global efforts there.
One of the really big policy shifts mentioned was allowing priests to bless same-sex couples in 2023. That stirred up a lot of debate.
It certainly did. It was seen by many as a significant move, a shift in practice, even though the Vatican was clear it wasn't recognizing same-sex marriage.
More of a pastoral approach.
Exactly. Trying to be more inclusive, but still within that framework of traditional doctrine.
We should probably also mention his personal lifestyle choices.
Yes, that was very visible, wasn't it? Choosing to live in a simple 2-room suite instead of the grand papal apartments.
Right, and the simpler clothes, the silver ring.
Yeah, the ring of the fisherman, usually gold. He had his maid in silver, only wearing the gold one for specific events. Deliberate choices reinforcing that humility message.
And he also had to continue dealing with the huge issue of sexual abuse within the church.
Yes, a very difficult and ongoing challenge. The article notes his commitment there, pushing for transparency, giving legal authorities access to documents, abolishing the untypical secret in abuse cases, continuing the work of his predecessors to address it and support survivors.
But it seems like, even with all that, he still faced pushback, frustration from different groups inside the church.
That's a key thing to understand, yeah. Conservatives often felt his language, his approach on social issues like sexuality or divorce wasn't strong enough in defending traditional views.
The filial correction.
Exactly. That formal document accusing him of theological errors really highlights that tension.
But then progressives were frustrated too.
Yes, absolutely. Many had hoped he'd go much further on things like abortion, gay marriage, ordaining women, priestly celibacy.
But he didn't change those core doctrines.
Largely no. He upheld the traditional teachings on those major points. So he was kind of caught in the middle, navigating these very different, often opposing expectations.
The article mentions his efforts on Catholic unity, too.
Right, trying to foster unity across regions and viewpoints, but even that sometimes drew fire from both sides.
Like the restrictions on the Latin Mass.
Yes, his letter, Traditionis Custodes, that caused significant backlash from traditionalists who felt marginalized.
Yeah.
And his firm stance against women's ordination remained a sticking point for others.
And the situation in Germany really brought those unity tensions to the forefront, didn't it?
It really did. The German Catholic leadership exploring potential changes to doctrine led to some pretty strong reactions from the Vatican.
Emphasizing communion with the universal church.
Exactly. His letter to the German church, quoted in the article, stressed that local churches need to stay connected to the whole body to remain, vital and authentic.
Okay, so beyond the internal church stuff, he was obviously a major figure on the world stage.
Hugely active internationally. He traveled extensively, visited dozens of countries. The U.S. and Cuba in 2015 was a big one.
And reaching out to Muslim nations, too.
Yes, important trips to places like Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, really showing a commitment to interfaith dialogue and engaging with the wider world.
We also need to remember the health issues he dealt with throughout his papacy.
That's true. He had sciatica for years, which caused a lot of pain and sometimes affected his mobility.
And there were hospital stays?
Several, yes. The article details them. Intestinal surgery in 2021, respiratory infection treatment and abdominal surgery in 2023, a fall in 2025, and then bronchitis just this past February. It highlights the physical toll of the job.
Finally, the article uses the term sede vacante. What does that mean exactly?
Ah, yes. Sede vacante. It's Latin, literally means empty seat.
Okay.
It refers to that specific period after a pope dies or resigns and before the new pope is elected. There are specific rules and procedures for governing the Vatican during this time while they prepare for the election.
Got it. So, bringing this all together, looking back through the lens of that Fox News report, it paints a picture of a papacy trying to weave contemporary perspectives into the church fabric, right?
While managing those deep internal divisions.
With this consistent focus on mercy, humility, and a real willingness to jump into global issues, political and social.
Definitely.
And being the first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit, his time was marked by some significant policy moves, but also holding the line on core teachings.
Right.
Leaves behind a really complex legacy.
It really does. He was definitely trying to bridge gaps inside the church on the world stage, but always within the bounds of fundamental doctrine. Which leads us to a good question maybe for our listeners to ponder.
Yeah.
Reflecting on how Pope Francis tried to balance all these different, often competing pressures. What do you think the biggest challenges will be for his successor, leading the Catholic Church forward in this rapidly changing world?
That's a big question.
It is. It makes us look not just at his impact, but also think about what lies ahead for the church.